They didn't even wait until the meeting was over. In front of 200 people with the microphone crackling above my head, I heard my name followed by the words that would erase nearly 2 decades of loyalty in a single breath. Ilara Voss, you're finished here. The room went silent. Chairs creaked, papers stopped rustling, even the air seemed to hold still. All I could feel were hundreds of eyes drilling into me, some shocked, some pitying, others satisfied that it wasn't them. I stood there frozen while the CEO's son smirked as if he had just won a prize. My chest tightened, but I refused to give them what they wanted. No tears, no begging. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. In that moment, I wasn't just being fired. I was being erased, humiliated, displayed like a warning to everyone else in the building. But deep down, behind the sting of betrayal, a strange calm settled in. Because while they thought they were burying me, they had forgotten one thing. You can't bury the person who built the foundation you're standing on. And soon, they were going to find that out the hard way. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? And more importantly, have you ever been made to feel invisible at work? Like all your effort and sacrifice could be tossed aside in an instant? Leave a comment if this hits close to home. Your story might just remind someone else that they're not alone in what they're going through. For 18 years, I was the person who kept everything alive at Stratacor's Chicago headquarters. My title sounded ordinary systems architect. But what I really built was PulseNet, the platform that moved billions of dollars across borders every single day. To the executives, it was just an invisible machine humming quietly in the background. To me, it was blood, sweat, and years of sacrifice, stitched together line by line. I can still picture the nights when the office was empty, just the glow of monitors and the distant hum of servers. While others slept, I was patching code at 3 in the morning because a single glitch could ripple through entire markets. I wrote algorithms while sitting in a hospital corridor, waiting for my mother to come out of heart surgery. I carried my laptop everywhere, birthdays, holidays, even funerals, because PulseNet didn't care about my personal life, and the company always demanded more. People used to joke that I was married to the system. They weren't wrong. I knew its language better than I knew my own. Every protocol, every security gate, every hidden safeguard, I built them with my own hands. Others came and went, but I stayed holding the network steady while flashy managers took credit on stage. What they never saw was the cost, the strained voicemails from family asking if I'd make it home, the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. The quiet resentment of being praised in private but dismissed in public meetings. Still, I kept going, because deep down, I believed the company would remember who kept its heart beating. But standing in that boardroom, hearing them cut me loose, I realized the cruel truth. They had convinced themselves that I was replaceable. They thought the system would run just fine without me. What they didn't know, what no one in that room fully understood, was that PulseNet and I were bound together in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. And soon enough, they were going to learn that the hard way. His name was Brandon Mercer, the CFO, the son of the man who sat at the very top. He carried himself like he had been born to own the building, strutting through the halls with his designer suit and rehearsed smile. People whispered his title with respect, but it wasn't respect he had earned. It was inherited, passed down like a family heirloom. I remember one board meeting in particular. We were hours away from closing a $1 billion international contract. The tension in the room was heavy. Every word mattered. And yet, Brandon leaned back in his chair, joking about how the deal was basically in the bag. His arrogance almost killed it on the spot. Investors grew restless, their confidence shaken. I spent that entire night rewriting code, fixing errors that his careless bravado had triggered. By dawn, the system was stable again, and the contract was saved. Brandon walked out of that room with applause. My name was never mentioned. That was his pattern. He spoke loudly while I worked quietly in the background. He took bows for victories he didn't win. And he believed with a kind of blind certainty that the company's future revolved around him. What made it worse was how many people played along, some out of fear, others because they saw no point in challenging the Mercer family. I would sit in meetings biting back the urge to speak, listening to him rattle off buzzwords while executives nodded as if they were hearing brilliance. But underneath the polished exterior, I saw what others chose to ignore. Brandon didn't understand the system, not really. He didn't know what made it run or what would happen if the wrong piece was pulled away. He was a prince holding keys to a kingdom he couldn't begin to comprehend. And that's why the humiliation he tried to script for me wasn't going to end the way he expected. Because when the system started to stutter, everyone would finally see who had been holding it together all along. When the announcement was made, they didn't even lower their voices. My name was spat out like a warning to the rest of the room. Brandon leaned against the table with a grin that told everyone this was his stage. "Escort her out," he ordered, as if I were some stranger who had wandered into the wrong building. 2 security guards moved forward, their footsteps echoing in the boardroom silence. I could feel the air shift, colleagues shifting in their chairs, some pretending to study their laptops, others staring openly. No one dared to say a word. Not one voice rose to object. That silence cut deeper than the order itself. I gathered my things slowly, each motion deliberate. My badge, my laptop, the notebook where I had scribbled fixes that had saved them millions. In my head, I kept repeating, "Stay calm. Don't give them the satisfaction." But inside my stomach churned. Years of service and sacrifice reduced to a public spectacle. As the guards flanked me, I walked through the hallway I had paced thousands of times before, this time under a spotlight of shame. People stepped aside, whispering behind their hands. I caught fragments. What did she do? They're making an example of her. Every whisper felt like a thorn. At the elevator, one of the guards held out his hand. "Your access card," he said flatly. I paused for a moment, staring at the little piece of plastic. That badge had opened every door for me. Server rooms, control centers, late-night coffee runs. It had been my key to this world. Dropping it into his palm felt like closing a chapter I hadn't agreed to end. The doors slid shut behind me, and for the first time in years, I was outside looking in. The glass tower that once felt like a second home now loomed above me like a fortress I'd been banished from. But as the wind whipped down the Chicago street, something unexpected stirred inside me. Not defeat, not despair. Something sharper, steadier. Because deep down, I knew one truth. They had just cut me loose from their chain. But in doing so, they had also cut themselves off from the only lifeline they had left. I hadn't even made it halfway down the block when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was just another notification, some routine email that I was still copied on. But then a second vibration came, and then a third. I pulled the screen up and my stomach tightened. Error alerts, dozens of them. Inside that glass tower, PulseNet was choking. Transactions that normally cleared in seconds were suddenly frozen. Contracts worth millions sat suspended, blinking in red. I could imagine the scene upstairs. Brandon standing in front of the giant dashboard wall, trying to laugh it off. "Just restart it," he would say, waving his hand as if the system were some cheap laptop. But PulseNet didn't work like that. You couldn't just press a button and make it obedient. The alerts kept stacking authentication failures, stalled transfers, unreconciled accounts. Each one felt like a pulse pounding louder. I stopped on the sidewalk, watching the skyscraper where I had spent nearly half my life. Behind those mirrored windows, panic was spreading. I didn't need to be in the room to hear it. The rising voices, the nervous whispers, the CEO's sharp commands cutting through the chaos. My chest ached with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. This wasn't how I wanted it to fall apart. I had built PulseNet to be resilient, unshakable, but it wasn't invincible, not without the one thing they had just thrown away. I pictured Brandon again, barking orders, his confidence slipping with every passing minute. He thought he had ended my story. What he didn't realize was that my absence had just written the next chapter. I tightened my coat against the Chicago wind, my phone still buzzing with alerts. Each vibration was a reminder they could lock me out of the building, strip me of my badge, humiliate me in front of everyone, but they could never erase the code I had etched into the company's veins. And as the errors spread like wildfire, one question hung heavy in the air, a question everyone inside would soon be forced to ask out loud. What happens when the system itself refuses to move without me? From the street below, I couldn't see their faces, but I could almost hear the panic rising inside that building. Later, I'd learn exactly what unfolded in those tense minutes. At first, the engineers did what they always did. They tried to troubleshoot. Lines of code scrolled across their screens, error logs blinking like alarms. Brandon stood behind them, arms crossed, his voice sharp. Fix it. Restart everything. His confidence cracked a little more each time nothing worked. That's when the whispers began. It started with one of the junior developers, a kid barely 2 years into the company. He stared at the console, shaking his head. "It's like it's waiting for her," he muttered. Another voice chimed in, softer but certain. "None of this makes sense without Ilara's key." Word spread quickly, rippling through the room like a current. "She built it. The system won't run without her. It's almost like it knows she's gone." I imagine Brandon snapping back, trying to shut them up. He would have hated the way their eyes shifted toward the empty chair where I used to sit. He would have hated the way my absence felt heavier than my presence ever did. And yet, those whispers couldn't be silenced. They grew louder with each failed attempt, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were truths being spoken out loud. Truths everyone had ignored because it was easier to pretend I was just another cog in the machine. Down on the sidewalk, my phone kept buzzing with alerts, but I found myself standing still, frozen by a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes. Vindication, definitely. But also something deeper. The ache of knowing I had poured myself into a system so completely that people now described it as if it had a soul. And if they thought the situation was bad already, they had no idea what was about to come next, because the real storm hadn't even started. By the time Richard Mercer walked into the control floor, the air inside that building had already shifted. Panic hung thick like smoke. Screens flashed red across the wall, every failed transaction a reminder that something vital had slipped out of their grasp. Richard wasn't a man who usually needed to raise his voice. His presence alone commanded silence. But that day, the moment he stepped in, his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. What the hell is going on? I imagine Brandon pale, but still trying to play the role of authority. "It's under control, Dad," he probably said, waving a dismissive hand toward the engineers. But the engineers didn't look convinced. Some wouldn't even meet his eyes. Their silence betrayed the truth before anyone else could speak it. Richard turned, scanning the room. "Where's Ilara?" His tone wasn't casual. It was sharp, almost accusing. Brandon stiffened. "She's gone. I fired her." For the first time in years, the great Richard Mercer was speechless. His jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with disbelief. "You what?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the words Brandon had never expected to hear in public. "You idiot!" The engineers exchanged nervous glances, whispers sparking again, louder now, emboldened by the crack in their leader's armor. "She's the one who built it. It won't run without her." Richard's face shifted from fury to something far rarer, fear. He lowered his voice, but it carried weight. "Get her back." And for the first time, the man who had never once thanked me, never once acknowledged what I had sacrificed, had to admit it openly in front of his son, his board, his entire company. He needed me. I can only imagine the look on Brandon's face in that moment, the humiliation, the rage, the dawning realization that his downfall was already in motion. But that was only the beginning, because the system wasn't done reminding them who it truly belonged to. The tension inside that control room must have been unbearable. Every screen glowed red, every number screamed loss. And yet, Brandon refused to accept what everyone else could see. His pride wouldn't let him. He stepped forward, past the engineers, past his father's glare, and slammed his badge onto the scanner. For a brief moment, the system responded. A green light blinked, and the words appeared on the dashboard, "Access granted." Relief swept across the room like a gust of air after a long suffocation. Some of the younger staff even clapped nervously, desperate to believe the nightmare was over. Brandon straightened his suit and smirked, soaking in their applause as if he had just saved the company. But then it happened. The monitors flickered, the green glow vanished, and in bold, unforgiving letters, a new message appeared across every screen. Root authorization required, original architect only. The applause died instantly. The room froze. You could almost hear the heartbeat of every person present pounding in unison. Brandon's smirk collapsed, his confidence draining as fast as the company's money. He tapped the scanner again, harder this time, as though force could bend reality. Nothing. The words remained glowing, brighter, almost mocking him. Someone whispered, "The backup is nothing without the original." It spread quickly, passed from mouth to mouth, until it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a verdict. Richard stood stone still, his face unreadable. The engineers avoided eye contact, but their silence said everything. The power Brandon thought he held had just been exposed as an illusion. The system had spoken, and it hadn't chosen him. And outside, standing in the cold Chicago wind, I felt the vibrations on my phone as alert after alert poured in. I didn't need to see the screens to know what they said. I had written those safeguards myself. Brandon thought he had won. For a fleeting second, he believed he was in control. But this was no victory. It was the beginning of his unraveling. And the countdown had only just started. If there was one thing the Mercers cared about more than pride, it was numbers. And that day, the numbers turned into their worst nightmare. On the main display wall, the system projected a real-time ticker. For years, it had been a symbol of stability, millions flowing in and out with flawless precision. But now, the numbers were falling like a free-falling elevator. Current loss, $500,000 per minute. At first, people thought it was a glitch, a false alarm, but the figure updated again. $1 million lost in 2 minutes, then 3, then 4. The silence in the room grew heavier with each tick. The engineers sat frozen, their fingers hovering over keyboards, afraid to touch anything that might make it worse. Brandon's voice cracked as he tried to speak. "It's temporary. It'll correct itself." But no one was listening anymore. All eyes were locked on the red numbers climbing faster than anyone could process. Phone lines lit up. Partners from New York, London, and Singapore were demanding answers. Contracts worth billions were now frozen midair. "Someone read out an urgent email. Our investors want to know why Voss isn't in the room." My name spoken in panic echoed through a place that only hours before had discarded me like dead weight. Richard Mercer pinched the bridge of his nose, the calm mask finally cracking. The weight of every shareholder, every angry call, every dollar lost pressed down on his shoulders. His empire was bleeding in front of him, and he had no control. Meanwhile, I stood outside on the street, my phone buzzing nonstop with each new alert. Each vibration was like a drumbeat, reminding me of the years I had poured into the system. I felt no joy, no triumph, just a cold clarity. Because numbers don't lie, and these numbers were spelling out the truth louder than I ever could. Inside those glass walls, they were finally beginning to see the cost of underestimating me. And soon, the verdict wouldn't come from the system alone. It would come from the people watching everything unravel. What happened next wasn't a technical failure. It wasn't about code or numbers on a screen. It was about people. For years, I had been invisible inside that company, the quiet worker, the one who fixed things at midnight, who stayed when others left, who was never mentioned when applause was handed out. But on that day, as the losses climbed and the system refused to obey, something shifted in the room. One of the engineers, a kid who had shadowed me on late-night deployments, stood up from his chair. His hands trembled, but his voice carried. "This won't work without her." At first, no one responded. Then another spoke up. "She built the architecture. None of us can override it without her authorization." The room filled with murmurs, then agreement. Heads nodded. Voices grew bolder. What had started as whispers was now a chorus. The illusion Brandon had clung to was dissolving right in front of him. Brandon slammed his hand on a table. "This is my company," he shouted, his face red with fury. But the words rang hollow. Everyone could see it now. The Emperor had no clothes. And then it happened. That same engineer, the youngest in the room, began to clap. Slowly at first, his palms echoing against the silence. A second person joined in, then a third. Within seconds, the entire floor erupted in applause, not for Brandon, not for Richard, but for the name that kept surfacing in every conversation, mine, Alara. It spread like fire attached to the rhythm of their hands. A name they had ignored for so long now carried the weight of salvation. Richard stood frozen, watching as his own people judged the situation with their own verdict. No court, no shareholder meeting, no press release. Just the raw truth made public in the one place it mattered most. And while Brandon screamed to drown them out, it didn't matter anymore. Because the collective had already chosen a side. Their applause was the sentence. And the real judgment, the one that would change everything, was still waiting to be delivered. The applause inside that glass tower must have felt like thunder. It wasn't for Brandon, and it wasn't for Richard. It was for me, the name they had tried to erase only hours before. I wasn't there to see his face, but I can picture it clearly. Brandon shouting, his fists clenched, his pride collapsing in front of everyone. And Richard, stone still, realizing that the empire he had built now depended on the very person they had just cast aside. That's when I decided it was time to play the card I had kept hidden all these years. PulseNet wasn't just lines of code. It wasn't just a system I had built for the company. From the beginning, I had made sure to protect my work. Every safeguard, every line of architecture, every root command was registered under an LLC, mine. Quietly, legally, carefully. I had filed the papers in Delaware, signed the contracts, and buried the clauses in the fine print. Clauses that only mattered if one thing happened: termination without cause. Well, that day had come. What they didn't realize was that the moment they cut me off, the ownership of PulseNet reverted back to me. Not Stratacore, not the Mercers, me. So when the engineers begged for me to return, when the boardroom buzzed with panic, I didn't rush back in. Instead, I let the truth sink in. I let them see the system, flash those words across the screen, original architect only. Because it wasn't just a line of code. It was a fact written into law. The empire they thought they controlled was never truly theirs. It had always been mine. And now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I wasn't just the invisible worker in the shadows. I was the owner. The applause that had started as a whisper was about to turn into something much bigger. A verdict no one in that building could escape. Because the next move, The final move would be mine alone. When I finally walked away from that glass tower, the cold Chicago air hit me like a wave of clarity. Behind me, the building still buzzed with chaos, board members scrambling, investors demanding answers, Brandon shouting into a storm he could no longer control. For years, I had been tethered to that place, living by its demands, sacrificing time, health, and pieces of myself to keep their empire running. And yet, in the end, it wasn't me who was trapped. It was them. I didn't need to stay and watch their empire crumble. The truth was already written across their screens, their contracts, and their own silence. PulseNet was mine, and without me, they had no lifeline left. Richard Mercer, a man who had once ruled every room he walked into, now had to face the fact that his own arrogance and his son's recklessness had undone everything. As for Brandon, humiliation was a punishment sharper than anything I could have planned. The applause that once fed his ego was replaced with the sound of people siding against him. That sound will echo longer than any title he ever held. And me? I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. I felt free. For the first time in years, I walked the streets without a badge weighing heavy on my chest, without my phone tethered to late-night alerts. I realized that sometimes being cut loose isn't a loss at all. It's an opportunity to step into your own power. If there's anything this story has taught me, it's that knowledge and integrity are the real leverage. Titles can vanish, offices can close, people can turn their backs, but the work you've built, the truth you've lived, that always stays with you. So I'll leave you with this. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated, only to realize that the very thing they dismissed was your greatest strength?